here in just a minute. As you know, most of you are aware, Royce is one of the candidates for our open faculty position. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, there'll be a session with Royce and graduate students. So this is exclusively a time for graduate students to come and talk with Royce and ask questions without the encumbrance of the faculty being there. So we encourage you to do that. This is an important decision not only for us as faculty, but it's an important decision for you as consumers of this program. So just encourage you to put that on your schedule if you can. And I'll turn time over to Steve to introduce Royce a little more. Ipso, sorry.
Yeah.
Ipso, okay. And then Steve.
So there's one more spot for a soup sign up on the 10th of December, so the website's up on the board as usual. Just to reiterate what Charles just said, tomorrow morning is the student meet and greet with Dr. Kimmons, 9 to 10:15, I believe, in the studio. And there will be free food. I think it's probably going to be the usual fruit and bagels, I imagine. And then right after that, at 11 o'clock in the studio, it's going to be the mentoring, and there will be pizza provided. I think we've got like 11 pizzas coming. So we've titled tomorrow Free Food Thursday. If you remember nothing else, show up in the studio. That's it.
Okay.
Oh, and if you have questions, please post them on the Google Plus website.
Okay. Okay. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Kimmons to you all here, who is, as Dr. Graham said, interviewing for a position in our department currently. Okay, so Royce Kimmons is currently a faculty member at the University of Idaho, where he has a dual appointment as an assistant professor in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction, and also as the director of the Docheo Center. He has earned his bachelor's degree from here at BYU in philosophy, and more recently earned his doctorate from the University of Texas at Austin in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction. With specialty, in terms of his research specialty, in generally speaking, the interface between technology and education. And today, Dr. Kimmons, more specifically, will be talking to us about color theory and design. So, Dr. Kimmons,
Great.
The floor is yours.
Thank you.
All right.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's a great opportunity to be here. As was mentioned, I was a student here at BYU, and so I haven't been back in 10 years. So it's a great experience to just walk around a little bit today and see how things have changed or have not changed. But love the culture of BYU, love being here, and I think it's a great honor to be with you all today. BYU has a special place in my heart for lots of reasons. Probably the greatest reason is this is where I met my wife. So we now have 3 little girls, and we both look back on our time in Provo. Our youngest one isn't seen here, but we both look back at our time at Provo as being a great time of our lives. As was mentioned, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Idaho. I'm also the director of the Docheo Center, which I'll hopefully talk a little bit more about my research a little bit later. But in short, the mission of our center there is to improve K-12 teaching and learning in the state of Idaho through effective technology integration. So that includes doing pilot studies with schools, analyzing what's going on, evaluating what schools are doing with technology and so forth, and informing the state in their decision making. So for my topic today, I picked color theory and design, and I think probably coming into this, a lot of people probably thought, well, why are we talking about this? What does this have to do with this instructional technology and so forth? And it's a good question. And I decided to do this because looking through your course requirements, I noticed that it's at least a topic that you look at in some of your introductory design classes. And given this audience, I know we have everything from probably first-year grad students to faculty members. So it's a wide range. So I wanted to do something that we could all talk about, that would be something that we could all have a common vocabulary about, right? And that would, but at the same time, would hopefully be at least a little bit meaningful for everyone, no matter where you are along that spectrum. So this emerges really out of a issue that I ran into early as an instructional designer. Because as an instructional designer, sometimes projects are put on, you are the only person on that project. You are a team of 1. Other times you might be a team of 50, right? And depending upon the scale of the project and kind of where you are, if you're in a prototyping stage or in your final stage, you may have people with you that are really thinking about visual design. You may not have people that are. But no matter the size of your team, no matter what stage you're in, you're always going to have clients you're working with that do have opinions about visual design. And I ran into this issue very quickly when I created a prototype for a client, and he came back to me and said something to this like this. He said, it needs to pop. And to this day, whenever I hear the word pop, I cringe, because I hate that word now. But when he said it, you know, I then said, okay, well, what do you mean by that? Because the word pop really meant nothing to me by itself, right? So I sat down with him, had him explain to me kind of what that meant to him and what does he really want it to look like. And as he was explaining it, the visual that I was creating in my mind based on his explanation looked something like this. And in my toolkit at the time as an instructional designer, I didn't know how to say no to him, right? I could talk about learning, I could talk about all kinds of things, but I couldn't talk about visual design. Even on a rudimentary level. And I thought, well, isn't it all subjective? I mean, yes, I think this is hideous, but maybe he thinks this looks good, right? Well, so when I put this up here, a lot of people laughed. And, you know, this was my response, but I didn't necessarily say this to him, right? But I didn't know what to say. What about this design? What is your reaction to this? Okay, so well, let's do a brief experiment. How many people in this room? Let's compare these two. How many people in this room prefer this design of those two? Okay. How many people prefer this design? Okay, most people. Now, obviously, there's some other things going on here, like organization and font size and those kinds of things, but color is a big piece of why we are choosing one over the other. But we just showed that it's not purely subjective, right? It's not that, you know, 20% of our population are going to prefer this. There should be some common guidelines that we can all understand should help inform our color choice. And so that's what I want us to talk about very practically as designers. What is the baseline understanding we need to know about color to make informed choices and to help inform our clients, right? And even have that conversation. So I think to talk about this, we need to take a step back to elementary school and remember color is light, right? You take white light, you break it up, you get lots of different colors. That's the basis for all the color that we work with. But ultimately, color is something that we perceive in our mind, right? It's based on natural phenomena, but it's basically an interpretation in our mind of what we're seeing. And colors can have different effects on us. They can make us happy. I heard soothing a second ago. Or they can be painful. And in fact, the CIA has studied this. They've studied forms of no-touch torture. And one of the ways that they have studied to do torture without leaving broken bones and things like that is to use intense visual stimulation, and then you pull it away. And so I think as instructional designers, we don't necessarily have to try to become artists, but we do need to at least make sure that we're not torturing people by the designs that we create. So let's talk a little bit about color and emotion. If you're opening a website and you saw something like this, it's grayscale, to type in your password, what emotion do you have to that? What reaction?
Boredom.
Boredom?
It's kind of neutral.
Kind of neutral, yeah. And that's actually what we find. Blacks, whites, grays, they're kind of just neutral. I mean, boring, but just kind of you don't feel anything. What about this? Welcome. Would you type your password into this? Maybe. What about this? Okay.
High levels.
No, yes.
That looks dangerous.
What about this? Dangerous, right? Would you put your password in here? No, I'd carefully read what this was saying before I put my password into here, right? Yeah. So what is it about these colors? They convey very different emotions to us, right? And it gets down to, you know, going back to elementary school, the color wheel. If we put all color on a wheel, colors have relationships to one another. They have relationships to colors that are nearby them on the wheel, but also relationships to colors on the opposite sides of the wheel. We have things that are called warm and cool colors. So warm colors would be what?
Orange.
Orange, reds, yellows. Cool colors would be blues. So one side of the wheel excites us, the other soothes us. Go ahead, Charles.
Are those, I don't know, but are those interpretations of warm and cool and whatever, are those culturally dependent?
Good question. So there are two issues we'll talk about. So partially, but partially not. So, yeah.
Is there a reason that some of those colors are split in half?
That's just like kind of generally understood where warm and cool. So this is all a spectrum. It's not like there are 12 colors and this one's half cool and half warm. It just kind of, this is where the tipping point is. But generally warm colors grab our attention, they're more exciting. Cool colors calm us down. So when you see this, we're seeing this artist has used saturated colors that are both warm and cool. Where's your attention drawn to? The hand, which are the warm colors. The cool colors just kind of in the background and we don't really notice it as much. And to get to Charles' question, part of this is physiological. So the way that your eye perceives color is that your eye has cones in it. And there are different types of cones. There are red, green, and blue cones. Not that that's their actual color, but that's what they perceive. And you have different numbers of cones in your eye. So in your eye, you have 2 blue cones. You have 32 green cones, and you have 64 red cones. That means that when you see the color red, it's firing 64 cones. When you see the color blue, it's only firing 2 cones. That translates into intensity for your brain. And so when we see these colors, so colors further down here, we have a more intense reaction than these other colors. Now, you can't use this to create a mathematical equation that red is 32 times more intense than blue, because it turns out cones have different levels of sensitivity, and blue cones are actually the most sensitive. So blue cone is not equal to 1 red cone, but red tends to be more intense than does blue. So that's part of it. And businesses know this. And the way that they market their products, the way they create logos, the way they design their sites, speak to this. So when you look at these different logos, you should recognize most of these, if not all of them. When we see these, I think we have different emotional responses to this. And a way to think through this is what would happen if we flip these? So we have Facebook, Pinterest, and Twitter up here. What would happen if Facebook was red? If you went onto Facebook and instead of the blue bars, it was all red, what would your reaction to that be?
That's angry Facebook.
That's angry Facebook. What about Pinterest? Pinterest is red. Is Pinterest angry?
Energetic.
Oh, with Pinterest it's interpreted as energetic. What if Pinterest changed to blue?
Yeah, I could go either way.
I don't know.
Not cool enough.
Okay. So, but I don't know that we all agree necessarily on exactly what it means, but it conveys something, right? There's something to color choice.
Did you notice that iTunes recently went to red?
Yeah.
Oh, did they?
Yeah, it kind of totally changed.
Blew your mind. Nice. So when we're talking about color intensity, it's not just the colors that we use. So we said red is the most intense and blue is the least intense. It's also the saturation of the color. So fully saturated color, so fully red will be much more intense than a washed out red, right? So here we have 100% saturation and 20% saturation. So pink would be an example of a washed out red. This is much more intense and it evokes much more emotion than does this. And if you look at a color wheel, this holds pretty true all over the place. So more emotion is found on the outside of the color wheel, and as you move in and becomes washed out and white, you have less emotion. Also, and this gets to the cultural question that Charles raised, is that they've done studies and found that part of it is physiological, so our eyes and intensity and things like that, but part of our emotion to color relates to what we're connecting color to in the natural world, right? So if I live in a place where the sky is always blue and calm, when I see blue, that's what I connect it to, right? And they've done studies and found that these natural colors, or colors that are standard, that we can relate to things in the natural world very easily. So what is this? What's something in the natural world that's this color? Fire, what else? Flower, apple, cherry, green, apple, grass. Okay, we have positive reactions to these on the top. What about this? What's a color in the natural world that is cyan? Or what's something in the natural world that is cyan? Ocean, sky, maybe. What about this color? Easter, pastel Easter eggs. So as we move to these more kind of manufactured colors that we don't connect to things as easily in the natural world, we don't have as positive a response to them. And then the least positive responses are to, again, the grays and blacks and whites, or it's just neutral. We have no emotion with those whatsoever. So when we're thinking about design, we should think about what is this evoking in the people that are using our tools, right? What are they thinking about as they see this? And is it a clear connection for them? So nature uses color all over the place. And it uses lots of different colors. So if you think about that really horrid design I showed you at the beginning, this uses probably just as many colors as that original design did, but it uses it differently. Do you have a positive or negative response to this? Positive. So let's talk about why that may be. But just one last caveat, because we've been talking about design a lot. But ultimately, this has to connect to learning. We talk about Bloom's taxonomy a lot. But typically, when we talk about Bloom's taxonomy, we're only talking about his cognitive taxonomy. He also created an affective taxonomy. And in order to accept things, in order to engage with instructional materials and have our worldviews changed as a result of that, we have to be receiving. And so if I go to a website that is very intense and I feel like it's attacking me on a visual level, then I'm not going to be able to move up this ladder. I'm not going to be able to internalize the content of that website as well. One last word on this as well. When we think about color, there are really two ways of thinking about color, two approaches. One is subtractive, one is additive, and you see this in, so the printing world uses this approach, the web design and application world uses this. Basically, the only difference is this deals with like paint and ink, this deals with color and light. Red, green, and blue make white? Yes, they do. So in light, when you add those three together, they make white. And you can actually see this on your screen. If you've never done this before, it's pretty cool. If you get a good enough magnifying glass, you can see the pixels on your monitor. And the pixels are actually, each pixel is 3 different dots together. And so if your monitor wants to show you green, what it'll do is it'll take the red and blue dot and it'll make them black and it'll only show you the green. If it wants to show you red, it makes the red fully saturated and makes the blue and green go away. But if it wants to show you white, it has to show all 3 colors at full saturation. And that's why when we use RGB color schemes, it uses all 3 colors. Same with hexadecimal, so if you use HTML, same idea. So let's get to really the crux of this is color harmony. So how do we make color look good, and how do we make it something that is visually attractive, is not going to torture our audiences? Because we can use in color, we can use very saturated color, we just have to think about how they work together. So this image uses both very warm colors and very cool colors, and they work together very well. So working from the color wheel, we're going to talk about a few different approaches. The first is a monochromatic design. Monochromatic design means mono, one color. So we basically just pick one color and we run with it. So if I am a university and my school mascot or my school color is blue, I might decide to make my university website blue and then just make different washed out versions of blue as well. So so it's all the same hue but just less saturated. Does that sound familiar to anyone? So here we go. So the BYU website starts with this color, which is a fully saturated hue of blue. You can see down here on the color wheel, the bottom left. And then it just washes it out. And it washes it out gradually. And you can't see it very well up here. But it gradually moves in the color wheel to the center. So there's actually lots of different shades of blue. It's all the same hue, but it's just different saturations. What do you think is the benefit of doing this kind of a color scheme?
It feels very tied together, very organized.
Okay, feels organized, tied together. Connected. It's
Easy.
It's easy. It's simple. Go ahead.
I was going to say, the layout is really simple, but that means that if you put something else in the middle, like this picture, the picture really pops.
Okay, great. So maybe that simplicity, there we go. Maybe the simplicity is good because it allows the content to kind of take charge. Great. What would be the negative of this kind of design? What if I don't have content that pops?
It's bland.
It might be bland or boring, right? So that's the trade-off. The second approach is an analogous approach. And so if, say, again, we're starting with blue, an analogous approach would say that we then take the colors nearest to this on the color wheel. So we take blue, violet, and azure. Or we can go one step further, go blue, magenta, and cyan. So an example of this would be the Harvard website. And this isn't a perfect example, but it's fairly close. So they start with this color here, and then you notice that they use colors that take about a third of the color wheel. So the color's about evenly spaced around the 1/3 of the color wheel. So they're still on the same quadrant of the color wheel, but they're pretty much evenly spaced apart. And so over here you'll see you have a red, you have a blue, and then you have a couple in between. Benefits to this type of approach?
It kind of meets in the middle. It's still simple, but it's a little more, it stands out a little.
Okay.
Interesting.
A little bit more interesting, but still pretty simple.
I noticed that the content, the picture actually matches, like
Yeah.
things pop out from the content.
Yeah.
And match.
So what if it didn't though? What if this was like a green or something like they're yellow?
It might clash a little.
It might clash a little more.
Told her to wear a
It might have. Okay, so that was, what was that called? Analogous. Okay, the third is complementary, and this is kind of counterintuitive, because when we say complementary, we think they go hand in hand, right? But this is actually opposite ends of the color wheel. And so if I was using blue, complementary color would be yellow. Red, complementary would be cyan. The reason that this works is that our brains connect these two colors together even though they're on the opposite ends of the color wheel. Any of you ever look at like a picture of the American flag in a negative form, and if you stare at it long enough, then if you look away, you start seeing it the way that it should be? Anybody see that before? That's because our brains connect those two colors together. They're on the opposite ends of the color wheel. An example that most of us are probably familiar with is Boise State's colors. So they have this really rich blue, which you'll see down here, but then they also have this orange, which is on the opposite side of the color wheel. And these two colors, though we would not necessarily intuitively think they go together really nicely. And so their website is predominantly blue, but they use the orange accents, and it has a pleasing effect on us, right? I don't know, I think it does. I think it looks good.
What about when you put it all over their football field?
Okay, that's a different question. Well, yeah, and another question would be, what if the page was half blue and half orange? What would happen then, right? So if we are using these two very different colors, we need to think about how much we're using each one. There are also complex approaches, so like Google does this. Like if you create a triangle on the color wheel or a rectangle, you could do stuff like that. The problem with this is because you're introducing so much variation, so you notice it's almost a perfect rectangle, you have to be very careful about how much of the page space you're using. So that's why most of Google stuff is all white, but then they just have their little logo there. And the last way that is actually we see a lot is achromatic. So what do you think that means? No color whatsoever. There are some very prominent websites out there that use achromatic approaches. Can anyone think of any? Apple. So if you look at the design of their site, there is no color in the design of their site. But there is color in the site. What does that mean? Why? The product. The product. So if we look at this, where are our eyes drawn to? The products. So they use an achromatic design in the sites to make their content look much more rich. So you notice on the color wheel is all white. It's right there in the center. The church newsroom does this as well. So the church newsroom design is just black and white. But they can pull this off because their content is really rich. What would happen again if these images were gone and it's just text? Yeah. Looks like a paper. Okay? So those are some of the main approaches. If you want to learn more about these or explore these some more, there's a great site at color.adobe.com that allows you to create your own color schemes, and you can even look at different approaches that we talked about in addition to some others. You can also upload images and see color schemes. So this is the one that we looked at before, the Mother Nature picture. And you'll notice on here, Mother Nature with fall leaves uses an analogous color scheme. Andy, go ahead.
Royce, can you make it back to the Apple display? What would you say, why would you say they chose mountains to show you here?
I don't know.
I'm just wondering if what they're trying to do is to create this emotional impact. Mountains have an impact on you.
They might be. I mean, obviously, Apple changes the content of their website a lot, but it seems like whenever you go on there and you see one of their big screens displayed, it's always some natural image. It's either someone surfing, or it's mountains, or it's a landscape. So I think getting back to the natural world is something that designers really try to do a lot. And I think looking at this, one of the things that you can do if you're trying to design something you can do is take a picture that you think is really beautiful, upload it to here, and see what colors are used, and use that as a starter point for your design. Peter, did you have a question?
No.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. So 5 simple rules. So practicality for designers, 5 simple rules to live by. First of all, make sure your color is thematically appropriate. This may seem like a no-brainer, but it's not always. So you'll see people making instructional materials for CEOs that are bright pink and things like this. I don't know. So just be aware that your color conveys a message whether you intend it to or not. And just think about what message that might be. That might be a cultural message, but it also just might be the intensity and those kinds of things that we were talking about before. Second is, one color should rule them all. So even if you're using a complex approach like an analogous approach or a complementary approach, one color should be dominant. So again, think about the Boise State website. If you were to look at that website, what is the dominant color of that? Blue. It's blue. Orange was just used very little as an accent. In the same way, you can use these colors in these organizations, but you should always have one dominant color. Go ahead.
Based on that Boise State one, you mentioned earlier how warm colors are more intense. If they had switched that and made orange the dominant color and blue the highlight,
Yeah.
it might have felt very aggressive.
Yeah, it would have been very different.
So would you say then when we use these, and I forgot, I apologize. What
No,
did
it's
you say
fine.
was that analysis?
Complementary.
Complementary. When we use complementary colors, should we then more often lean towards using the cooler colors as the dominant color?
Maybe. I think that, well, so another example might be YouTube. So YouTube only uses really one color, which is red, but they don't use it hardly at all, right? And so it's a white site with just a couple of red accents. So I think if you're going to use color a lot, then yeah, you should really lean toward your cool colors as that dominant color. But I think a lot of sites get around that by just really relegating color down to just a very small part of the page. YouTube, again, why do you think you have a more visually interesting design?
Focus on the video.
Focus on the videos, focus on the content. That's what's rich. So counterbalance your content. So make sure that if you think about what is the content that you're using, if your content is really interesting and exciting, then your design doesn't need to be. If your content is really bland, then you may want to be thinking about a little bit more exciting design that pops.
Can I get that picture?
All of these memes are on imageflip.com, so you can go make your own memes there. And then 2 more. Step away from a spill. Have you ever walked into a room where there's like a dirty diaper and it really smelled really bad, but then you had to stay there? What happens over time?
Sensory fatigue.
You don't even smell it.
You don't even smell it. So it's called olfactory overload. Our body has a response that turns that off over time so that we're not in persistent torture. I think it's the same with our vision. If you stare at a design that you're creating for 20 hours, eventually you're going to start liking it, no matter how ugly it is. So you need to step away. Not only step away and like go take a nap or whatever, but step away and go look at nature, go look at beautiful pictures. Then when you come back, your reaction to that design will be much more similar to what other people's reactions are going to be. And then finally, less is more. St. Antoine d'Exupéry said, a designer knows they've reached perfection when there's not when there's nothing left to add, but when there's nothing left to take away. You need to be very careful about adding stuff to a design over time, but you should be very free to pull stuff away. And if you look at modern web design practices, you see a move to simplicity. And so those are some rules that I think are helpful. Let's take some questions for a couple minutes, but then I also want to talk to you about some of my research as well. Go ahead.
So, what's it got to do with education? You know, as far as like how could color enhance someone's educational experience? You know, having an understanding of this. Is it just on web-based educational thing? Is that all you're talking about?
So yeah, good question. So I think part of it gets back to the affective domain that we talked about before.
Don't make it distracting.
Right. Make it a non-issue, but also to make it, inviting. And so much I'm finding in education now, because there's such a push for education has become a market. And before, I think it used to be a service, but now we view it more as a market. And so when we create educational products, often those products have to be created in a way that not just people can learn from them, but we can make it very clear to potential funders or to decision makers that this is interesting, this is exciting, this is valuable. So I think it may be a sad state of where we are in education right now, but the marketing piece of being able to market our products and the things that we create has become much more of an issue now than it has been in the past. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I run into issues all the time where I need to get a funder on board to help me to create this thing, but they don't catch the vision of the learning. And so unless first I help them to catch the vision of the visual, right, that they can appreciate it as something that shows that we put effort into it and thought into it and it's visually pleasing. So I think it'd be interesting to do more work on this, on color theory and how it relates to learning outcomes, but those are the two pieces, so affective domain and then also the marketing piece. Go ahead.
So I learned a little about color stuff when my wife was planning her wedding, picking the colors and things. And are there terms, or can you say more about deciding about making a color primary and accent, or are there other ways of like having a primary and a secondary and an accent, or what, like that structuring of color choices and what's going to be accent? Can you say anything more about that?
Well, I mean, just different communities do different things. And again, I don't think we need to become artists in here. I don't think we need to become web developers or graphic artists. But I think we just need to have a basic understanding of some of these concepts. So I think different communities, use different terminology. I don't think we necessarily need to do that, but I think we need to be able to talk about dominant colors versus secondary or tertiary colors, and just these types of schemes. Because if this client had the client that told me the design needed to pop, if I could come back and say, well, actually, we need to use complementary colors because blah, 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 that would have been a much better situation. Okay, so again, this is intended to just be an introduction to at least give us some understanding of how we can communicate with clients, communicate with our teams for this purpose. So how about, I'd like to talk about my research now, and then if you guys have more questions of this, we can come back to it, or we could talk about my research. Does that work? Yeah. Okay. So I said I want to talk about my research, but I also want to talk about outreach and teaching because they all connect together. And in my work, the three are really one and the same. If you look at the research that I've done in the past, I just took all my titles and I put it into Wordle, and there are lots of terms, lots of things that I'm interested in, lots of things that I've studied. And just to give you an example, so I've studied everything from educational games, so designing educational games for K-12 students, and studying how K-12 teachers and university faculty use social media in their professional lives, to writing theoretical papers on technology integration models, and designing spaces for teaching and learning. And that has transitioned now into issues of open education. Right now I'm teaching an open course on open education to K-12 teachers across the state of Idaho. But really the common theme, the golden thread that connects all these things together for me is that I want to help people make informed decisions about technology integration. And this comes from, I used to teach high school, was quickly thrust into a tech management role at a charter school that I helped found, and I very quickly saw that people didn't know what they were doing, especially when it came to technology. Not just in the charter school, but in the district and in the state. And people were making decisions not based upon research, but they were making decisions based upon whatever vendor got to them first. And so I decided that I needed to explore different things to help inform these people to make informed decisions. And actually, so I went back to get my PhD so the district would listen to me. And I've never talked to that district again. But now other districts listen to me. So just to give you a sense of kind of where I'm at right now, kind of some of the things that I'm interested in. So I mentioned I'm the director of this center. One of the big issues we ran into early on is so much of the educational literature out there is really focused on a single context. So a single school, a single classroom, a single district. It's not generalizable. And so when states want to do like a statewide one-to-one initiative, which was being slated a couple years ago in Idaho until it was struck down, what do they have to go on? Well, they're taking this one study that was done in this classroom, now we're trying to scale it to the entire state, and we think that somehow it's going to match up. So I became very interested very quickly in trying to figure out, what is the generalizable evidence about tech integration? What are some generalizable or ways that we could use data in interesting ways? And I think that we are in a golden age of data right now that allows us to explore some of these questions in ways that we haven't in the past. So 2 examples that I've been working on lately is that I wanted to understand what learning management systems and content management systems and those kinds of things schools are using across the state of Idaho, because no one knew. They might send out surveys, but most people wouldn't respond. And if they did respond, you'd only get, just 1 or 2 answers that weren't very accurate. So I thought, well, there's got to be an easier way of doing this. So I wrote a web crawler that would crawl all the websites of all school districts in the state of Idaho. And from that, I was able to figure out what are all the learning management systems that are used across the state. Then I was able to take that and I was able to compare it to student outcomes, compare it to things like demographics, so how much is the school spending, and so forth. Because the state's contract with Blackboard is coming up here soon, and I wanted to go to the state and say, okay, listen, this is your contract, these are the schools that are using Blackboard, and these are how they are faring in comparison to these other schools, because that kind of data just doesn't exist. So I think that's an interesting way, and I'm still in the process of doing this. I had one paper that's just accepted on student outcomes. I have another one accepted now on open education, because another issue I saw was that lots of schools that would really benefit from adopting open source systems aren't. My question was why? And so I actually found that part of the reason is social capital in the school, that the wealthier schools, the larger schools are adopting open source, the smaller ones aren't. Which is counterintuitive, right? It goes against the narrative, but that's what's happening. And so, I'm interested in taking this kind of study and scaling it now. So that's Idaho. I'm sure we'll probably find similar things across the US, but same principles could be used elsewhere. And no one's doing it. No one is doing web crawling. Another thing that I thought was interesting is if we're doing all these pilots across all these schools, how do we collect data in a way that's meaningful, especially when these are rural schools and I can't send out someone out to observe the classroom every day? And how do we do it over time? So I wrote it is an anonymous tracking script that basically anyone can install in their browser and allows us to track everything that they do on their computer in an anonymous way. So the only thing that we know about the person is whether they're a teacher or a student or a teacher candidate. And there's no way for us to track it back to them. So I don't know their IP address, I don't know what school they're at. And what this has allowed us to do is to figure out what are differences in web usage patterns between students and teachers and college students. Because people have done this kind of research before, but it's always in survey form. And then you run into issues of self-reporting, you run into issues of self-selection bias, and so forth. This gives us a very clear longitudinal example of how these different groups are using technology differently. I think a couple interesting things here are multimedia. Notice that students are only 22% of students are using multimedia, and the average student of these 22%, they only use multimedia 93 times over the course of a year. Contrast that with our teacher candidates, and you see something very different. And our teachers, and you see something very different. Why?
What's a teacher candidate?
This is a teacher education student, so a student that is about to graduate to become a teacher. So you notice these two are actually fairly similar in their patterns. These are very different. So this is important to schools because schools make policy decisions all the time. And if a school is operating on the assumption that our kids don't need access to multimedia, which would lead to something like this, well then what does that mean for what's going on over here? Why do our teachers and why do our teacher candidates, what are they doing with multimedia? Go ahead.
What's the source of data again?
So this is, we're tracking what they're doing on their computers. The web browser. The web browser is a source of data.
So if teachers and teacher candidates all tended to use one device, you might get a different picture than if students were accessing content on multiple.
Right, you would. But these are devices that we give to the school, so these are devices that are used in the classroom.
So this is during their day in the classroom?
Yes, yes. We can make it so that because it's browser-based, it could be extended to like their home computer use and that kind of thing. But yeah.
So it's basically showing how they use the technology during the class day.
Right,
during the classroom.
right. So this is still early phases, but I think there's some interesting things that can come out of this. And I think there are also some interesting things from a learning analytics perspective as well, and using a browser as a container for learning analytics. Because when we talk about learning analytics, typically the LMS is the container. But how much of learning actually occurs in the LMS? Right. People are going out to external sites, they're doing all kinds of stuff outside. So why don't we think about the browser as the container? So why can't we just write an app where you push this button and you have your learning analytics dashboard for what you're working on? So that's something that I'm interested in exploring down the road. But to really just kind of sum up my approach to research is I really think good research is about asking interesting questions. I'm not a quant person, but I'm not a qual person either, because I use whatever method I need to answer the questions that I want to answer. So if you look at my work, some of it's entirely quantitative, some of it's entirely qualitative, and some of it's theoretical. But I think that as researchers, we need to be careful not to allow our comfortable research methods to dictate what questions we're willing to ask. So I encourage everyone to really ask the interesting questions first and go from there. Just a brief example. So when I started at this center, we had a mandate to be the best at what we do. So, our center is kind of unique. There aren't many centers like ours. So I thought, well, we'll go to Stanford, and this is the center that our funder pointed us to as what we should be aspiring to. We're actually very similar in missions. It's just they're 4 times the size as we are. They've been around longer. But in our first year, we've done very well with our research productivity. So we have 4 people, so myself, a clinical person, and then 2 graduate students. And if you look at our per person productivity, we're outperforming them by a lot, and actually we're outperforming them overall as well. So the center just started. If you want to know more about it, you can go to doceocenter.org. Also, you can go to my website, royce.kimmons.me. You can find my publications and just more random stuff about me there. So thanks. Thank you. What questions do you have?
What does doceo mean?
Good question. That's the most common question. I didn't pick it. Our funder picked it. It means I teach. It's Latin. Yeah.
Can you go back to your research page for a second, or your website page?
Mhm.
Yeah. That's cool.
You're analyzing the colors now?
How do you choose those colors?
I don't know. Well, I had a colleague pointed this out to me. I tend to use much more cool colors in my design, but I think with this, I was sick of using blue, and I wanted something a little bit more intense, so I went to a green. Because green is so intense.
Royce, can you talk about the research you did while you were a PhD student?
Yeah. So when I was a PhD student, I started being interested in educational games. So I started there. I was on a project called Alien Rescue at the University of Texas. So I was on the design and development team for that, did programming to move it to the Unity platform, did some evaluation work on that with middle school students. So it's basically a ludic simulation, but it's basically a game-like simulation to help students to learn scientific inquiry skills. So it's a problem-based environment. So I did that for a couple years, but then decided to transition over into looking at, well, because I was interested in doing social gaming, taking that and putting it in a social network. But then as I started to think through that, all kinds of issues came up in my head about no one even understands what we're doing in social networks to begin with. How can I take games and layer social networks onto there when there's so much that I need to understand about social networks first? So I shifted focus to social networks. And so my dissertation was on teachers' uses of social media, particularly Facebook, just because that's what came up. And specifically, I wanted to understand, as college students went through the professionalization process to become teachers, how did their identity in online spaces change? How did their participation in online spaces change? Because you see these things every day about teachers getting fired for, posting this or that to Facebook or Twitter, right? And I wanted to understand why. What is it about them that makes them think they need to participate in that way? I just felt like there was a disconnect between policy and what the teachers were doing and how they saw themselves in those spaces. So I studied that. And it was a grounded theory paper, and really looking at what does it mean to have identity in a social network, and how do teachers see themselves, and how does that lead to them acting in certain ways? Because it turns out, I think the way that teachers are showing themselves in these spaces that gets them into trouble is in many ways dictated by the space itself. It elicits specific types of behaviors, and it awards certain types of behaviors over others. And so that was my dissertation.
Are you wanting to do more stuff with game-based learning?
Yeah, so whenever I can, I'm a code monkey. So I love to program. I love to just try things out. I love the Unity platform, by the way. There are certain platforms that I just love. Unity is one of them. Drupal's another one. But yeah, I get any chance I can get to code. But yeah, I'm interested in games. Go ahead.
What are some of the research questions that still aren't being asked but should be asked?
Well, so one of the big ones, as I alluded to earlier, is generalizability of findings in K-12. Because if you look at, I think one-to-one initiatives are a great example of this. If you look at the literature, you will hardly ever find any study that's ever been done that extends beyond a single school or district. And why is that? And part of it's cultural, part of it is just the social dynamics necessary to get a study up and running in a K-12 school. But part of it is I just don't think we have that expectation. And so I think that looking at trying to get large-scale data to compare results between schools is really important. And like the meta-analyses they've done on all these one-to-one studies show that there's no discernible impact. But that's not what you hear the decision makers in the state capitol reading, right? They read whatever this or that company gives them, that it's going to improve test scores by 40% or something like that, which Blackboard claims. So I think that's big thing. And I think, well, that's kind of the theme that I think drives all of my research, is I want to be sure that we are making informed decisions. And so that gets to informed decisions about our own personal use. That's why I did my dissertation on social media use, because I want to know how I as a professional should be using social media. And I didn't see any research to help direct me in that. So part of it's generalizability. Part of it is just questioning our assumptions. I think actually David Wiley was mad at me at one point because we published a paper on challenging the assumptions of open education. But yeah, so I think we need to challenge assumptions. We need to address generalizability. But I'm a big fan of open education.
Can I
Go
ask
ahead.
a follow-up question?
Yeah.
Because I do feel like big data analytics is probably going to be really helpful as you move towards a generalizable opportunity. How do you mitigate the concerns about profiling and privacy that are inherent in big data,
Right.
big data analysis?
Yeah, and I think that's a huge issue. And so ethics needs to be embedded into everything that we do in that area. So I guess just to give an example, so the example that I gave where we're tracking students and teachers' uses of their computers. So we're tracking 3,500 students, 50 teachers, and 50 teacher candidates. But we decided very early what choices we would make so that we would not run into those issues of profiling, of NSA type, worries. And so like some simple things that we did was that, for instance, again, like I said, we're not collecting IP addresses, we're not collecting anything that we can ever trace it back. Actually, the teacher and me, as I was looking at the data, I noticed that one student was going to a lot of porn sites. I wanted to know what school that was at so I could tell that school not so that the student necessarily would be punished, but so they could fix that problem. But I can't even do that. But that's a research decision because I don't want to be able to, I guess do that because of the other implications that could bring about. So there's that piece of it, but also the data that we're collecting. So I think we need to be careful not to collect more data than we need to answer the questions that we're asking. So like instead of collecting all the URL data and all the pages, we could take screenshots of every page that every person visits, but we're not doing that. We're only collecting the domains. And the reason for that is if I go to Facebook, if I go to my Facebook profile, my name would be in the URL. But if I just collect the domain, it's not going to be in the URL, right? So I think decisions like that and just being thoughtful about what data we're collecting is one piece of it. But then the other piece, obviously, is what problems we're trying to solve. So if you're trying to predict student achievement, that's a different issue altogether, right? And I don't know the answer to that, but I think in the short term, really thinking carefully about what data we're collecting and how we're collecting it is essential.
Well, let's give
Thank you.
I think we're planning on having the soup kitchen here.